Good evening and welcome to those of you who are just joining us for this UEA London Lecture this evening, including those joining us via Facebook live stream. She says crossing her fingers because we may have a technical hitch. My name is Professor Frances Bowen and I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Faculty of Social Sciences at UEA. And don't worry, the rest of my speech is not the same as I gave a few moments ago as I introduced the film. We've just enjoyed a screening, a very powerful film of the Merowe Dam, A Shattered Dream, which is a film featuring Prof Mark Zeitoun's research and his colleagues Dr. Natal Ali, Dr. Mohammed Jalal and Professor Asim Al-Moghrabi. I'm sure you'll all have loads of questions about the film and perhaps events in Sudan, but if you don't mind, we'll take the questions after Mark's lecture and we'll get some discussion going at that stage. But before I introduce Mark properly, I'd like to make a small request of you. We'll be sending a brief survey via email to canvass your views on tonight's event. Obviously, we want to plan future lectures to be as great as they can be, and we appreciate your time telling us your views. And if any of you are on Twitter, then I'd also encourage you to tweet your thoughts about tonight's talk using the hashtag UEA Live Lecture. It's not on there, is it? No, but hashtag UEA Live Lecture. For the benefit of those of you who are new to these lectures, the format's roughly as follows. Mark will speak around 45-ish minutes. If it's less, we get more questions. If it's more, we have to rush to the drinks. No, I'm joking. Then there'll be time for questions, and finally we hope that you'll join us for a drink in the foyer after that. But now to introduce our speaker tonight. Mark is Professor of Water Security and Policy in the School of International Development at UEA. International Development is one of the schools within social sciences. He's also a member of the Climate Change and the Global Environmental Justice Research Groups, and also Director of the Water Security Research Centre. Mark joined UEA's School of International Development. We all call it DEV. It's interesting to see it written out full of School of International Development, because those of us from UEA were familiar call DEV. So Mark joined DEV 10 years ago, meaning he's been in Norwich at least 3 times longer than he's been anywhere else since he flew his nest in Ottawa as a bright-eyed 19-year-old. And that was to Montreal to study civil engineering at McGill. Following a year in between studying structural engineering in Strasbourg, Mark graduated in 1990 with a zeal infused by his professors to pour some concrete. Of course, if you know UEA well, you know he came to the right place if concrete's his thing. And this he did, working in construction project management for several years in Canada, France, and Lebanon. But it was in Lebanon that his focus started to blur when the concrete got confused by real people. Whilst undertaking an MSc back at McGill in environmental engineering this time, he founded a small NGO called CPAL, that's the Canadian Educational Exchange with Palestinians. The experience with people displaced and distraught with water led him to start work with the International Committee of the Red Cross and other humanitarian agencies in 1999. Living for several years in Congo, Iraq, and the West Bank and Gaza, his task was to supply clean-ish water to people immediately after or right in the middle of fighting. This meant setting up refugee camps in Brazzaville, rehabilitating hospitals in Basra, and negotiating water pipes through checkpoints in Jenin. The latter whilst reading Tony Allen's The Middle East Water Question in between evening beers. Fed up with mopping up other people's messes, Mark left to London, where his fiancée, Samia, had just started a job. And Mark marched into the author of that book's, Tony's, office in King's College London. Tony's with us here this evening, to tell him how little he really knew about water in the Middle East. And he left 2 hours later with his tail between his legs and a great passion to study the issue in much more detail. And the PhD under Tony's supervision set him firmly on the path that he remains on till this day. He was doubly fortunate to be under Tony's wing during his period and work with the extremely synergistic and creative scholars at the London Water Research Group, as well as a team of world-class professionals assisting the Palestine Liberation Organization in their water negotiations with Israel, known as the Water Team and led by Dr. David Phillips. Following a postdoc at LSE, Mark hit his academic stride at UEA. With Bruce Langford and Declan Conway, he founded the Water Security Research Centre, the Water Security Short Course, and the Water Security MSc. He continues to pioneer conceptual thinking on the role that power plays in determining the outcome of water conflicts, known as hydrohegemony. Mark has written dozens of media articles and journal articles. He sits on the boards of 2 journals and has just completed his 2nd book. He still convenes the MSc and remains inspired by the fresh perspective and optimism that the students bring to his now cynical self. Tonight, Mark will be sharing the insights that he has gained into water and war throughout his career. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Mark Zeitoun to give tonight's UEA London Lecture. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thanks a lot, Francis. When you put it that way, it all sounds so joined up, almost even thought through. The reality is, of course, much different. It's messy, full of dead ends, U-turns, missteps, mistakes, and regrets. But my only consolation now is that my rate of missteps is slowly reducing. That's either because I'm becoming comfortably numb or because I pay more attention to illuminating experiences. Is it the same for you? Do you find that the most illuminating experiences are also the most humbling? A little bit annoying, that. One of the brightest bulbs that went off in my life was upon meeting the woman outside on the west bank of the Jordan River making pressed yogurt. I'll call her Layla. I was a water engineer at the time, sent to teach people how to save water, which, coming from Canada, I knew very little about. She was the same age as my sweet mother, and was straining the yogurt by hanging it over a plastic bucket and catching each drip of the whey and the water as it spilled through. She told me she did this because water was so precious and she had to save it to feed the chickens so that she could feed her family. I could see that she had no piped water supply, so I asked her why she didn't just collect the rain. And she explained to me how once her sons had spent about a month working the ground around her to channel the groundwater into an underground to channel the rainwater into an underground reservoir that would then feed her goats through the dry summer months. But then the men from the occupying army, the soldiers from the occupying army, or the men with the guns, as she called them, came and destroyed it overnight. Being Palestinian, she had no right to build a permanent dwelling, much less to collect the rain. And apart from the humility that I felt, because I had absolutely nothing to teach her, the bulb flashed for me 3 times that day. The first was to show the true value of water in places where it's scarce. A second time to show how people can use it to help others. And the third time to show how people use it and value it very much differently than Layla does, other people. And I've been thinking about this ever since. I went on to become a water policy analyst to advise on water negotiations in the Middle East. I teach water security to university students. I've helped build the most complex water treatment plants in the safest of places and the most basic tap stands in some very hairy war zones. I canoe as much as possible, get onto the water as much as possible, and generally try to get people excited about water at every turn. I do think about other things too, like, no, maybe I don't. Yeah, right, envy my 7-year-old son then who gets dragged to water treatment plants while his mates are at the theme parks. Or my wife on holiday who gets pulled away from the art and architecture of the palaces into the center of the courtyard where the well is. What drives me is the inspiration I get every time I see water, not least of all the way it reflects willows on the riverbank. Could be very different for you. It could be the smell of a flower garden after a gentle rain, or the relief that's felt when the monsoon finally breaks the heat, or the energy that's sensed at the confluence of 2 rivers, which is such a holy place in so many different religions. It could be the way that a freshwater spring attracts people, water collectors, like hummingbirds to a feeder, or the comforting drip, drip, drip of water falling off a green leaf into a puddle. These are all outward expressions of water's inner grace. And what makes water so different than oil and diamonds and other things that we fight over. What really fascinates me is the great lengths we go to spoil that grace. I mean, water can nourish, stimulating growth, thought, poetry, dance. But, and as the comedian Gil Stern says, man is a strange creature. He makes deserts bloom and lakes die. Water can also cleanse, thereby keeping us and all other beings sentient, creative, and healthy. But we pollute rivers only to treat them through rather elaborate mechanisms again, just so that we can drink the water, rather than not polluting it in the first place. And water can unify, because it's available to and connects us all. But we let it divide us between the powerful and the less powerful, between the haves and the have-nots. So instead of nourishing, purifying, and unifying, we use water to starve, contaminate, and divide. It's going to take a heck of a fight to turn this situation around. That's why I'm here tonight, to enlist you in the war for water, the war to restore water's inner grace. To win that fight, we're going to have to do like Layla and so many unknown soldiers and reverse two dominant trends. The first is our unquenchable thirst, and the second is our destructive use of water. I'll take each of those in turn now. Here's a diagram of the water cycle. Well, sorry. I think part of the reason that we can't ever get enough water, why our thirst is unquenchable, is because we don't really understand the way water moves around in the world. Here's the hydro cycle that you were taught when you were 6 years old. You've seen this before. Rain falling off the clouds, from the clouds onto the mountains, into the rivers, out to the ocean, and back up to the clouds again. This is a cycle that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and what connects us all right now, and what connects us with everything that's ever lived. My son nails down the importance of this when he says that it means that we drink dinosaur pee every day. And it's true. In fact, we're connected through the hydro cycle with every breath we take. But we teachers then drop three big labels onto the diagram: condensation, transpiration, evaporation. And then we try to emphasize the cycle by doing ever faster and ever tightening hand gestures, rather idiotically. And the net result is that no one retains any of this stuff. And we don't remember where our water comes from, really, or where it goes. And we end up repeating the same quite obvious mistakes over and over again. Now, hats off to all the engineers who get us water 24/7, 365 days a year, at least those of us who are lucky to have such a secure supply. But I've noticed that the more that our supply is secure, the more we take water for granted. And the more we take water for granted, the more we're likely to value it solely in economic terms, like any other object or commodity, the way mutton was once sheep, or the way lumber was once a forest. To be priced and traded on the open market. And that's when our thirst just can't be satisfied. I'll give you an example. Do you know where the asparagus that we eat in the UK comes from? I mean, outside of this month when we grow it ourselves? From the deserts of Peru. Through drip irrigation that lays exactly the right amount of water at the right time in exactly the right location. The equivalent of over 3,500 Olympic-sized swimming pools every year, just to satisfy the UK demand for asparagus, in one of the driest places on the planet. The asparagus is then wrapped in styrofoam and plastic, shipped across a couple of continents, and driven out to your local corner store throughout the UK. The business is so lucrative that when the groundwater levels started getting out of reach of the pumps, the growers simply diverted the headwaters of the Amazon River to continue to quench our thirst. What we're doing here is maximizing the amount of crops per drop. Or indeed, as Tony Allen says, the amount of dollars per drop. Like alchemists turning water into gold. But what we're not doing is safeguarding the environment, or even making sure that the benefits from this are distributed in any sort of equitable way. I mean, we've had Mother Nature on the run for over a century now, and the best that we can come up with are these hyper-efficient systems that benefit only those who can afford it. So if pricing water was a good enough way to circumvent the selectiveness, then everyone in the world would have access to safe water. But just last month, the World Bank released yet another report showing how it will cost $30 billion to get safe, secure water to everybody in the world. That's actually not that much. It's roughly the size of the annual military budget of Italy. So it's obviously a political situation more than an economic or technical situation. And even for those who do have a piped supply, your access depends on your ability to pay. Look at the city of Detroit. The municipality turned off the taps to thousands of people who couldn't pay. Of course, the government, the water companies in this country can't do that because the government forbids them to do that. Students, take note. You don't have to pay your water bills. Your tap won't be turned off. But that right to water is guaranteed by, it came about through people who fought for the right, not just, it wasn't just given to us. And it's a right that we will have to fight to maintain. But what happens if we turn the taps off for even more cruel reasons? Which brings us to the second destructive trend that I think we have to reverse. I don't know about you, but I've been told that water is life with such monotonous regularity that I'm going to lose my hair if I hear it again. In any case, I'm not so sure water really is life, because from what I've seen working in water conflicts, I've seen water used as a tool of war. Water can be death, too. During World War I, the Allied teenagers controlled the weirs to flood the trenches in order to drown the invading teenagers. Snipers always settle in near tap stands or springs, waiting for their prey, usually women, to come to them, the way that hummingbirds go towards a feeder, like here in Sarajevo. Standing armies do their bit too, destroying water infrastructure indiscriminately with indirect effects compounding the direct effect of explosions and accumulating into devastating outcomes in terms of communicable diseases, destroyed livelihoods, shattered homes, bones, dreams, and mental health. Meanwhile, some military lawyers are under pressure to bend the rules of war from an even safer distance away than the snipers are. Now, we developed the rules of war, or IHL, International Humanitarian Law, or the Geneva Conventions, it's all the same. We developed those to try to limit the amount of pain and misery that men could inflict upon each other. So the rules say, for example, that you can shoot an enemy combatant in the chest, but you can't gouge his eyes out with a spoon. And you certainly have to take care not to target civilians or civilian objects. That's the legal term that's used. But some lawyers are under pressure to interpret it differently or to allow more collateral damage when their army strikes with heavy weaponry into a crowded neighborhood. More collateral damage means more damaged water treatment plants and wounded children. The destruction of water reservoirs in southern Lebanon by the Israeli army seemed more targeted. We counted over 55 in total, nearly 1/3 of all that existed in the south. As far as we could tell, some of this was deliberate and some of it was indiscriminate. The deliberate being to clear the killing fields and to prevent the return of families so that the killing could continue, or the fighting could continue. They may have picked this up from the former Yugoslavia, where the men with the guns dumped the bodies of the people they killed into the backyard wells. It's an effective tool, murdering granddad and throwing him down the family water source so that the family won't ever come back. And here, water's inner grace of cleansing holds true, but in the most cynical sense of the term, to preference one group of people over another. Meanwhile, back in the West Bank, Palestinian residents fetch spring water on the backs of their donkeys, and the water pipes that are laid down bypass the villages to go towards the settlements, to support the settlements for the people who are colonizing their land. Layla, who is prevented from even collecting the rain, has since left, which is, of course, the whole point. Now, we can do even more dangerous things with water. We can use water to trigger conflict as well. Consider the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The two rivers have been depositing silt at their confluence that they've been carrying down from southeastern Anatolia for millennia. Great soil, hot sun, loads of water. No wonder so many people called it the Garden of Eden, or paradise on earth. Abraham himself had a home nearby, I was told, when I lived there in 1999. But it was mostly deserted when I got there. There was a lonely apple tree, which some local entrepreneurs insisted belonged to Adam, the first man. And beside that, there was a white van with Adam's ice cream written in English and Arabic. It's delicious. But none of the fertile silt makes it down to the confluence anymore, because dams hold it back. Dams built in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, and in Iran. Notably, the Elisu Dam, which is just completed in Turkey and is being filled at this moment. So the once rich confluence is poor, and the crescent is no longer fertile. And the Iraqi farmers are left on their own. They end up buying food grown with water in upstream states rather than producing it themselves. Well, let's get back to the Nile, where the now deposed Sudanese government built the Merowe Dam that we saw in the documentary. It's the longest river in the world. It ends in Egypt in the Mediterranean and starts in Lake Victoria in the middle of Africa. Strange name for a lake in the middle of Africa, isn't it? There you go. So the Blue Nile rises in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, the DR Congo, and flows through South Sudan, where it's joined by the White Nile at Khartoum. The White Nile flowing off of Ethiopia through Sudan into Egypt and then into the Mediterranean. Now there's a great saying attributed to Herodotus that Egypt is the Nile and the Nile is Egypt. And it doesn't rain much at all in Egypt. And so, not least of all for the millions of Egyptian farmers, Egypt really is the Nile. But the Nile is not just Egypt. The Nile is also Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and the DR Congo. Nonetheless, Egypt has for decades been ensuring that upstream states like Sudan and Ethiopia can only build the types of dams that will suit their interests. I can elaborate on that during the question period if you'd like. The Merowe Dam was one of those. It produces loads of electricity, but also loads of displacement and tension. And the politics changed in the basin radically following the revolution in Egypt. And now Ethiopia is building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam upstream in a way that is sure to alter the flow and quality of the river for the downstream states in a very big way. And it will be the Sudanese and Egyptian farmers, already largely abandoned by the big men who control and run their states, that will be the ones to suffer the most when the decisions that are made so far from beyond their control. So the Egyptian and Sudanese farmers' intention, the Iraqi farmers' intention, it'd be too much to say that these tensions will automatically start a war, but that's not the point. These water conflicts are already damaging lives and livelihoods and deserve all the diplomacy and law that we can throw at them. The point is we have to stop using water for such cynical political and military ends and end this and transform the destructive use and unquenchable thirst for water. Excuse me while I have some dinosaur pee. And I'll pause here and just have an aside, because it hit me on the train down that we're not really talking about water at all, in a sense. The way we use and abuse water is really just a reflection of how we treat the wider environment and how we behave towards each other, isn't it? On many fronts, we live in regressive times. Facts have lost their meaning. Rationale has been bulldozed by the juggernaut of emotion. Nationalism has returned with a vengeance. And meanwhile, the best still lack all conviction, and the worst remain full of passionate intensity, to quote Yeats. So we've got to convert that passion to become wind in the sails, and all the while keeping a firm hand on the rudder, which means, in short, getting informed and then acting. So if you want water to be available for the most marginalized as it is for yourself, if you'd like to stop the opportunistic snipers and ethnic cleansers, if you'd like the dripping to remind you not of torture, but of rain falling off a leaf into a puddle, then join the fight to restore water's nourishing, cleansing, and unifying qualities. Victory will come through ensuring less detachment and more connection, less greed per gallon and more compassion per cup. Remember, this is a hard-nosed engineer telling you this. We must use whatever influence we have to further the cause, just like Layla and all the other unsung heroes. Raise a glass, then, to the public lawyers who forensically document the effects of armed conflict on water systems, so that the military lawyers and targeters cannot say that they did not know. And let's applaud those fighting injustices, the activists who prevent others from turning off your taps just because you can't pay for it. Without them, the pursuit of ever more dollars per drop would reach its logical end. Water for the wealthy, sewage for the slums. And a salute to all the water workers in the world, the women and men who are so committed to providing clean water that they risk the snipers' crosshairs to restore the services and to repair them. Hundreds have paid the ultimate price for their commitment to their duty, some of them my friends. And mostly due recognition for everyone fighting the water, to keep water, to help keep water nourishing, cleansing, and unifying every day. The fathers in the favelas who treat water through cloths, the mothers in the villages who walk miles just to collect it for their family, the people on the fringes of our society who are fighting against unchecked economic growth through a greater connection with the rain. These are the people to be inspired by. But then it's up to you, all of you, or all of us, to act, to push the social and technical frontiers, to seek out those humbling experiences, and to buck those trends, to make the tough decisions, to be those parents, to be the rain. More specifically, to promote the right to water and water law, to support the principles of the World Commission on Dams, to make sure your government follows the rules of war, to push for more public involvement in water decisions, to investigate the fourth phase of water, to join or become a river keeper, and to support the communities deprived of their fair share of water, like the Palestinians, Sudanese, Syrian, and Iraqis that we saw today, and so many people well beyond the Middle East. To help that kid who connects water with dinosaur pee today be the one who makes water available for people that he doesn't even know yet tomorrow. To resist and to fight the war for water with every breath you take. Thank you.
Is that working now? Yes, great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And between the film and your very provocative and thought-provoking lecture, Nourish, Cleanse, and Unify. I'm going to hold on to those. Thank you very much. Right. But I'm really hoping that there'll be some questions and get some conversation going here with people who've come to talk about these topics. So anything you would like to ask Mark? Who's going to get us started off? Give us a wave and we'll bring a microphone to you. Yes, there's a microphone on its way. The steps are steep, so I'll just ask the microphone people to be very, very cautious.
Actually, Mark, you give a bit of dark picture about the water situation in the world. Is there any maybe positive example about the water of being cause for peace, for instance, in the history? Thank you.
Sure, great question. Yeah, of course there are examples of people cooperating over water, thousands and thousands of examples. Usually not at the interstate level. I don't think we've really sorted that out at the interstate level. We're still too stuck with the idea of territorial sovereignty, but certainly between communities. So I haven't counted them all, but certainly for every conflict that exists, there's probably an equivalent example of cooperation that exists. It's just that, sorry, I should add, I don't emphasize that because I work in the Middle East, and there it's overwhelmingly conflictual. So my eyes are open to the reality that I see. It's unfortunately much more conflictual than cooperative.
It's okay, Mark. It's actually nice to get the optimism of your students rubbing off on you a little bit.
Yeah.
Question? Yes, go ahead. Somebody has?
I've got it in
so,
my
yes,
hand.
hello.
Thank you.
Hello.
Well, I must say this is one of the best seminars and lectures I've attended in this place. And I think one of the reasons is that I was one of the first students in Dev in the mid-70s. So it's brought things back and very evocative. Seeing the Murphy Dam and the displacement of people, this is always the case. Millions of dollars are spent on building a dam, but not enough is saved or contingency planned for resettling people. It seems quite incredible that in this day and age, governments kind of go roughshod over the civilians without consideration of their rights, human rights. They've lived there for centuries. They've got their land, they've got their parents or their ancestors' graves there. Yet the governments all over the place seem to ignore this simple fact. And I was wondering whether there is any way of actually seeing that this is a precious resource and needs to be cherished and preserved and used properly. Why is there not enough education in terms of educating the people, especially in the developing countries?
Great. Yeah, very good point you make about, it does seem, in some ways, depending on how you view the world, ridiculous or impossible that such things can happen in this day and age. But I've personally learned to stop thinking that we're always progressing as a society. Within the UK, I don't think so. I don't think that's the case. And certainly in many other countries as well. So we're constantly repeating, it's not history repeating itself, but we are repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again. I see them as mistakes. The Merowe Dam could have been built much better. The compensation should have been a lot better. But the way I would analyze that is to look at the interests involved. And the interest for the electricity to feed Port Sudan and to support the state and the state institutions being much stronger than the interests of the local people, who up until that point had very little contact at all with the government in Khartoum. So I see it as competing interests. I think your point is spot on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also just curious, before we go to the next question, how many people in the room have got some kind of connection with Dev as a school? Yeah, there's quite a few of us. Rock on, Dev. Yeah, you're welcome back, and keep that conversation going. So, sorry, the gentleman in red in the middle, and I'll look for hands in the back too. In the next round, I can see you now. Okay, I'll come back there in just a second. Gentleman in red first.
Yeah, I'm working with Muslim Aid, an NGO which we're working in the Middle East and Africa. I'd just like to ask your question. How far is the conflict, people have said the conflict in Syria was partially caused by drought and climate change, meaning that pastoralists went to urban areas. The same contention is in Nigeria as well. How far is that correct? And then the second question, how do we deal with that? I mean, and in Somalia, that's one aspect of the question. The second question is that most of these communities in sub-Saharan Africa and many other parts of the world are going to fall victims to climate change, and they're less able to deal with it than other people. And I think you missed out the Aral Dam in Central Asia as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Great questions. I'm not an expert on water in Syria, but I have worked in Syria. I know a little bit about it. I defer to people like Ala Khattab, who's here, and to the academic debate about the cause of the Syrian war. There are some really good articles where I side most certainly with Jan Selby, the University of Sussex, who makes the point, as I do in Palestine, that climate change is a very convenient scapegoat for what is ultimately political or man-made decisions. So even before the war in Syria, the government of Syria was taking people around to northern Syria and showing the effects of the drought. Whether or not that drought was caused by climate change is still up in the air. But there was a drought, certainly, and there was certainly an effect. Lots of people did move into the cities. But to say, or to suggest even, that climate change caused the drought, and the drought caused the people to move, and the people moving to the cities meant the conflict, this linear path to war, is to ignore the whole history of social tensions, oppression, all the other reasons that people, spoke about. They didn't speak about water when they were in rebellion. And so I don't think water was the main driver, or the drought was the main driver of the conflict in Syria. No, I don't think so. And I would also caution against, anytime you hear this, or you see this diagram, drought or climate change, arrow, conflict, you know something is being obscured, usually something important. And you have to look at the motives of the people who are pushing such a message. And if it's a government saying, we don't have enough water already, or there won't be enough water in the future, so let's just ignore how this transboundary river is distributed and desalinate or reach for some technical solution, then they're trying to turn the situation from man-made issues and blame it on God or climate change or Mother Nature or the global capitalist system, and then you can't get any sort of tangible results. When in fact it's always usually man-made decisions that are to blame, and those are the ones that can be reversed or guided. And therefore I suggest that we keep the focus on the politics of the water, all the while understanding the biophysical aspects of it as deeply as we could. And here I'm a protege of Tony Allen, who says the biophysical aspects of water are always subordinate to the politics of water.
Thank you very much. So just to go up to the back there, somebody has a microphone? Yes, excellent. Please just speak. I can't quite see you because I'm blinded, but I'll be able to hear you.
It's a general question around water. America's foreign policy is often aimed at controlling directly or indirectly oil. Is there a country or countries in the world who directly or indirectly try and control water, be it fresh water or just water in general?
The short answer to your question is there are a few. For instance, Egypt, where it really doesn't rain at all, and has built a massive infrastructure dependent on the water continuing to flow in the Nile. So water politics in Egypt is high politics in that country and in the region. And the previous governments have gone to great lengths, threatening or working with other governments to ensure that supply of water continues. And for obvious reasons. I mean, it doesn't rain in Egypt essentially at all. But mostly, water is completely unlike oil in that sense. For a number of reasons, I think men will go to war over oil, like in Iraq. We didn't invade Iraq because there is a lot of water in Iraq, but we didn't invade Iraq for the carrots or dates that we could grow with it, right? We, the UK and the US, invaded Iraq in part because of the oil. And controlling the oil means you can feed your war machine and you can control other countries. It's very different than water, not least of all because of the economic value, but also because water is a renewable resource. Oil is not. There's a finite amount of oil. There is a peak oil. The concept of peak oil actually holds. But water is constantly renewed. And so it's recycling all the time, getting back to the water cycle. And so it's not gone once it goes down your toilet or down the drain. And so it's a fugitive resource, very much harder to capture, and certainly very expensive to sell, to pump around and transfer. And it's certainly not worth the amount of effort and energy that it takes to control other countries or to invade other countries just for water. At the same time as I say that, there are principles of international water law for which I'm a very firm proponent of, that guide states on how to get over this rather interesting fact that water transcends borders, right? It flows across them, underneath them in groundwater, or over them in clouds, mocking the borders, and therefore throwing our ideas of territorial sovereignty to the wind. But all we can do is continue to work within these rigid borders that we draw straight up from the political borders of our countries, and somehow try to erode that sovereignty so that water issues are managed across boundaries in a way that makes sense, much more than the political divisions and the almost insane amount of nationalism that we cling to once we've made political borders.
Thank you very much. We'll go sort of a few rows down. Yes, lady with the microphone there. So your turn. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, thank you for your lecture. I have heard that there are schemes in various countries, I don't know how many, to change the perceived wisdom and remove dams and rewild rivers and start the flow again along the ancient routes of rivers to encourage fish to return, and also various types of flora that have just ceased to be. I don't know how widespread this is or whether it's just experimental. And is the trend for building more and more dams being gradually reversed or changing where they're put just because it's a political initiative to put a dam in a certain place?
Okay, great. The question is about rewilding rivers and
removing dams.
Demobilizing dams.
Yeah.
And I don't know too much about that, but from what I've read, I've heard that in the US we're decommissioning more dams than we're actually building. These dams being almost 100 years old, not serving the economic purpose that they once did, producing less electricity than they used to, and now with alternative electricity sources and a totally different economy than 100 years ago. And in a greater environmental awareness, people are decommissioning the dams and destroying them, which is a very expensive proposition. But it's wonderful to see. But that trend in the US is not the dominant trend in the world. Many developing countries, especially upstream states, are still continuing to build dams. And here, my own personal opinion on dams reflects very much the guidance of the World Commission on Dams, which says, the debates about dams go on, and there are pro-dam ideologues and completely anti-dam ideologues. And then there are people in between who say that some dams are good and they should be supported if they involve the people in the decisions and if the people benefit from them. And the bad dams are the ones that don't benefit the people who are affected. And those are the ones that should be opposed. So bad dams, no. Good dams, yes. And if you're talking about the development of a state, then dams certainly are a good way, relatively clean way, not fully clean, of making electricity in the long term. but always with some, sometimes extreme, sometimes lesser, so environmental damage and social damage, and that's what you have to limit, I think.
Great, thank you. We're really making Mark work here, aren't we, for his, but I'm thoroughly enjoying this. We'll take a few more. Maybe what we'll do, actually, is take several questions and just let you pick off some ideas in the interest of
Sure.
keeping things flowing. So there were several hands in this row, in this general direction down here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk. I wanted to ask something in terms of where you lent us in there being some solutions to conflict and the possibility of it, and maybe it not being the main factor behind the Syrian war, for instance, is something that indirectly affects it. However, I'm also aware that there is an increasing fear that there will be a greater scarcity in the future. And does that lean you, I'm not asking you to make predictions, but does that lean toward the probability of further conflicts arising connected to indirectly or directly to water scarcity in the future?
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe pass the microphone down in this direction. We'll take two more questions and then go in whichever direction you'd like, Mark.
Hello. I'm just wondering, in all your experience of different countries you've been in and worked in, if when it comes to conflict and displacement, do you notice that it's often women and children who are more obviously impacted by it? I'm only asking because often it's children who are left with collecting water, or women who are at home, doing the cooking and cleaning. So I was just wondering, in your experience, if you have noticed that, or if you think it's just that generally marginalised people as a whole are the ones who suffer the most.
Great, thank you.
Hi, you mentioned water obviously as a renewable resource, and you briefly touched on how you could expand on certainly places like Egypt, trying to control the types of dam that would benefit them upstream. But as much as it's a renewable resource and it would continue flowing, the quality of water is something that's quite different to the quantity of water. So would you be able to expand on those types of dam that certainly Egypt were controlling that's in their interest, and then how you would encourage countries to forward on things like fertile silt further downstream, or whether that also becomes a bit of a power play for countries further upstream?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the questions. I guess the issue you raise of the quality of water is something I omitted from my talk, and you're dead right to bring it up, because the quality of water matters almost as much as the quantity. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have enough water if it's polluted, if you can't drink it. So you're absolutely right to bring up the issue of quality of water. When it relates to dams, and for instance the High Aswan Dam in Egypt, or the Merowe Dam, which we saw in the documentary, the quality of the water is affected immensely. So it's not just the volume of water that's stored in the reservoir. Because both of those dams are hydroelectric dams, the water actually passes through, even if there is a reservoir, and continues downstream. What doesn't pass through is the silt that you mentioned. The silt that has formed these extremely fertile riverbanks along the Nile, which people have been using for thousands of years. And so when the silt stops, the farmers have 10, 15, 20, 25 years maybe to continue to farm their soil. But now, in the Egyptian farmers downstream of the High Aswan Dam, and now the Sudanese farmers downstream of the Merowe Dam, are beginning to buy fertilizers, so nitrogen, rather than, whereas they didn't need it before. So that's, of course, no good. It first of all costs them money, and secondly, you've got an artificial system where a natural system once existed. So that's a real problem, and engineers have not yet figured out a way to how to let the silt pass through the dams. And if we did manage to do that, then you'd be removing a lot of the impact, a lot of the environmental impact, but not all of it. And so there's no real solution. We were talking about solutions to conflict or solutions to dams. I mean, as in the introduction, I used to be optimistic because I come from Canada. I can see now in answering your questions, I've lost all my optimism. These dams do have impact. They will have impact. And there are trade-offs, and trade-offs everywhere I go tend to favor the more powerful people. So then it's a question of who pushes hardest, who shouts the loudest. And if you're going to be one of these people affected by dams or by a water conflict, other people in other states using water that you were previously using, then it's up to you and nobody else to make a fuss and to become active, to develop the campaigns and to begin to reverse the situation. Because typically the state won't help you, at least in the Middle East. When it comes to women and children, yes, usually it is the women and children who are hit hardest. And again, in the Middle East, it's a very much still a very gendered world and male-dominated world. And the women and children are normally affected first and foremost. At the same time, I don't want to paint them as sole victims because the resilience of the women, at least, I don't know about the kids, I think a lot of the kids get properly messed up forever. But the resilience of the women is incredible, and they're often behind the scenes helping fight this situation. But they are affected more than the men, I would say, in general, in the Middle East. Got time for a few more?
Well, we've actually, thanks to the wonders of modern technology, we've got one that's come in via Facebook because we are live streaming on Facebook.
Wow.
So here's a question from one of our Facebook viewers, and thank you for sending it in.
Yes, this is a question from Robin, who has asked about the role of Western transnational companies in water conflicts, if any, over water as a resource.
The question is about whether Western transnational companies have some impact on the water conflicts. That's a good question. I guess by Western transnational companies, they're thinking of big water companies like Thames Water or Bechtel.
So they've also added in their comment that they're aware of Western troubles, for example, on the US West Coast and Australia, so whether there's any relation there.
Okay, yeah, so in non-transnational internet conflicts, yes, certainly big multinational companies are part of the problem in many cases. So that's because we have to pin it down. It's either going to be a water company or a big agri-business company. Water, food is water. Again, Tony Allen came up with this concept of virtual water. 70 or 80% of the water that's used in the world is to grow food. And so if you're growing food and trading food around, then you're using a lot of water. And so if there's a big multinational that's growing a lot of food, like we saw in the asparagus in the Juanica Valley, then yeah, they are a player in the game, right? Their business is to make profit or to get food to us, and they are a player in the game. And it's right to focus on their role, because often they will be encouraging and creating the demand for asparagus, for instance, and resisting attempts to do demand management. I mean, why do we have to eat asparagus in November when it's not a local product? So we're right to draw attention to those multinationals, but at the same time, those multinationals really are just feeding our demand. They're creating our demand, but they're also feeding our demand, which points the fingers back to us, right? So it's the choices we make where we can control things. If we resist the creation of the demand through advertising, then we can stop the business if we're not happy with it. But again, with consequences for the farmers or the people who are growing the product wherever we are. So again, the trade-offs. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. So I'm actually going to pause it there, knowing that I'm sure that conversations will continue because we have so many people here who are actually engaged and obviously have significant expertise as well in the audience, so to speak, on some of these issues. But just on behalf of all of us in the audience here, including myself, thank you very, very much for your generosity and clarity with the questions. It's really quite impressive to watch. A terrific presentation. Congratulations on the film. We spoke a little bit before the start of this about some of the logistical logistical challenges of actually putting a piece like that together. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you very much to all of the colleagues from UEA who've come down and helped put this event on, and thank you for coming. Please do join us for some drinks in the foyer area, and join me in thanking everybody involved for today's lecture. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.